Welcome to the campus of Brigham Young University. I'm John Hughes for the International Media Studies program in the Department of Communications. This is another in a series of televised panel discussions on international communications topics. Today we're focusing on the former Soviet states, the republics that broke away from Moscow as change overtook the Soviet Union. By the end of this program, we hope to have enlightened you a little on what's actually happening in these former Soviet republics, and also have talked a little bit about how well Americans are informed about what's going on there, particularly by the American press, how well they're informed by the American press. We've gathered a group of experts to discuss these topics. The first is Leonard Baldyga, who's been a journalist and editor, but he's had a long career as a diplomat and an information specialist with the United States Information Agency. Mr. Baldyga has served in many foreign capitals, but also in Washington as Director of European Affairs, with special emphasis on the Soviet Union and the Eastern Europe. He was USIA's principal negotiator of cultural and scientific agreements with the Soviet bloc. Currently, he's a senior consultant in this sphere, and he's working particularly on Central and East European programs with the International Research and Exchanges Board. Our second panelist is Valerie Hudson. She's a professor of political science at Brigham Young University. She received her PhD from Ohio State. She's also taught at Northwestern University and Rutgers University, and she's been a visiting fellow at Australian National University. She's an expert in foreign policy, national security policy, and she's lectured and written extensively in these areas. Finally, we have Andrey Sidorin, who's deputy editor of a newspaper in Tajikistan, one of the former Soviet states in Central Asia. Andrey Sidorin received his diploma in philosophy from the Tajik Institute of Foreign Languages, and he's been a reporter for the Tajik Information Agency. He's currently in the United States as part of an international journalism exchange program sponsored by Freedom Forum and the American Society of Newspaper Editors. Mr. Baldyga, let me turn to you first. This is a pretty confusing area for many of our listeners. We've had 6 years ago, I guess, these states with the disintegration of the Soviet Union broke away and became independent. Some of them are European in character, some of them are Asian in character. Give us a kind of broad overview of what's happening.
Well, I can understand why there's this confusion because, primarily the breakout has resulted in a wide as possible range of economic and other developments in these countries. And what was formerly Eastern Europe, now countries consider themselves Central Europe, Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, was always considered part of the West. Eastern Europe now comprises countries like Ukraine and Belarus, which are now the new border areas for the countries that are now West Central Europe. You have the southeastern countries, Albania, Croatia, you got Bulgaria, Romania, and all these countries are different stages of development. The Stan countries, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, areas in which Americans had virtually no contact previously. They were restricted from traveling there, so the knowledge gap would have been tremendous. Then you have Russia itself, which it has 100 different languages and cultures in its broad range all the way from Moscow to Vladivostok. A terribly complex society. Understanding all this is mind-boggling, and people engaged in the area itself, like I, for the past 30 years, have difficulty tracking all the changes, dramatic changes that are going on a day-to-day basis in this wide area. So if you feel that you don't know what's going on, don't feel bad.
Dr. Hudson, insofar as we are educated by our press about this area, we get the impression that it's pretty turbulent.
There are areas that are very turbulent, and the turbulence has a wide range, as Mr. Baldyga was saying. For instance, in Belarus, we're not so much concerned about cross-border clashes, but the Belarus government is fairly authoritarian. Their economy is in a mess. There seems to be internal turmoil. The president of Belarus would like Belarus to rejoin Russia and to reassimilate. And that's very interesting. And then, of course, down towards the Caspian Sea, you have places like Azerbaijan and Armenia, Georgia, Chechnya, North Ossetia, where there's actual warfare going on, where blood is being spilt and so forth. And then we have other kinds of turbulence as you move more towards the stand countries, towards the east, where a complex game, political pundits in international affairs call it the great game, that's always played around Central Asia. And the new immense oil fields that have been discovered around the Caspian are attracting the attention of virtually all the major players on the world stage. In the idea that if they can capture the Caspian resources, then the balance of power in the entire world will shift. So these stand countries are now becoming very important. The United States has been active in this. In addition to our oil companies going in and being very aggressive in trying to carve out oil contracts, we also have the United States government trying to firm up almost quasi-alliances. Uzbekistan is now positioned itself as the foremost American ally in that region. And we have other interesting things going on I'm sure we'll talk about during this hour.
Mr. Sidorin, you're from one of these Central Asian states. You're from Tajikistan. How is the Russian government interacting with these, what I guess they used to call it the Soviet South, these states in the Soviet South now? How is Russia trying to forge alliances, or how to improve relations after a period of some testiness and turbulence?
I would say that after the collapse of Soviet Union, Russia lost their position in Central Asia, except my country, because Tajikistan is more pro-Russian state in the Central Asia, remains the most pro-Russia state. And from other hand, the Tajikistan is having the Tajik-Afghan border. It's the southern border of CIS countries. And of course the presence of the Russian troop contingent is about 30,000.
Yeah, about 30,000 Russian troops, yes, in Tajikistan.
Yes,
now these are border
Tajikistan.
troops, or they're
it's both. It's so-called peace collective troops of CIS countries. Most part it consists from the Russian Motor Rifle Division stationed in Tajikistan, and the battalion of Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, and Kazakhstan. And I can say the Tajikistan is a very little country, and it's like a hot knob of Central Asia, because a lot of countries, I mean, not only Russia, but Iran, USA, has trying to establish control, because Tajikistan has very important strategic situation in Central Asia.
You've got Afghanistan on the south, you've got China on the east.
Yes, and we need as well take into account the huge mining deposits. I mean the uran, non-ferric metals, silver, gold, and the big it's very attractive for biggest countries. And now the situation inside of country is very complex, and the Russia with now trying establish a new policy in Tajikistan, because the current government, Tajik government, is ally of Russia, and like Uzbekistan, the USA supported Uzbekistan, and Russia supported Tajikistan. It's a big game, I can say.
Dr. Hudson, how do you read this new Russian? I mean, I guess the Russians have been fairly heavy-handed at some stage, and is it post Chechnya? What is there now a diplomatic and an economic offensive? Have the Russians changed their tactics? What do you make of this?
That's a very interesting question. I think the Russian approach has not been as focused and as coherent and organized as one would think. I think that the Russians still don't know how to read the aftermath of the Chechen affair. What are the lessons for Russia? Did they do something right in signing this peace treaty with the Chechens? Did they do something wrong? Clearly the Russians didn't get everything they wanted. In fact, in this interesting new game about the Caspian Sea oil, one of the problems with this huge oil reserve, which is they estimate more than 200 billion barrels of oil, larger than any other field that has been found. One analyst suggested that this could fuel all the energy needs of the U.S. for 30 years. The question is, how do you get it out of where it is? And the Russians
What
were
are the alternatives?
Oh, there are numerous alternatives. They're fascinating. One is the Russians are very keen on having it cross Russian territory and going to the Black Sea port of Novorossiysk. But the territory it crosses is Chechnya. And part of the peace agreement was that the Chechens would only agree to peace if they got a cut of the transit fees of any pipeline that ran through their territory. The Georgians wanted it as well. It turns out the Georgians eventually did get it. Azerbaijan is going to pipe their oil across Georgia, but then it will end up at the port of Novorossiysk. Then there are other plans. Kazakhstan is trying to figure out how to get its share of the Caspian Sea oil out, and they're actually looking to the east and to the south, that perhaps they could either tap into existing pipelines that go through Iran, or that Turkmenistan, which has its own share of Caspian Sea oil, will strike a deal with the Afghan Taliban government, which is anathema in current international circles, and actually pipe it down through somehow out to the Indian Ocean.
The Taliban are the extremist Islamic forces that are in, somewhat in control of large portions of Afghanistan.
Right, and you can imagine that the United States is dead set against dealing not only with the Afghan government, but also with the Iranian government, having the oil go through Iran and out to the Persian Gulf. So there's a lot of maneuvering going on, a lot of cunning and strategy here.
Let me pick up on what you were talking about before. There has been a fundamental shift in Russian policies regarding the Central Asian republics. When you're back to the Posuh days, you had a sort of an Atlanticist, Western-oriented policy. Under Primakov and the current government, you've got a re-examination of the historic Russian ties with the region. The fact there are 9 million Russian ethnics in those countries. The fact that the Russians consider the borders of the countries to be its own borders in terms of security interests. The concerns of Russians over fundamental Islamic movements and the fact that it could spill over into problems in its own country. The concern of having lost all these assets that used to belong to them, and a feeling that somehow they have a right to be engaged as much as Chevron or the United States in exploitation of these resources. So people sympathize, in fact, with the Russian interests in this area, understanding their historic role. And Kazakhstan, I think, works very cleverly and cautiously in dealing with this in terms of how it deals with both the Russians and the West. And Turkmenistan felt the rage of the Russians when it signed a deal without considering the Russian interests, and found it the gas pipeline cut off. So you have to look at where the Russians are coming from in terms of their new policies.
Are there factions in the present Russian government, serious factions, that want to take back these states, or is it a much more subtle relationship than that?
Well, you hear that kind of stuff from the extremists, you know, Zhuganov and others, but that's not a realistic proposition anymore.
So what they're trying to achieve is a kind of Commonwealth relationship.
They're trying to get back to the original idea of what the Commonwealth was supposed to be, which never got off the ground.
Tajikistan is, as you say, probably the most pro-Russian of certainly of the southern.
Yes, but there are a lot of voices against of the presence of Russian troops in Tajikistan, in Russia, and because what's the reason for mother to receive the murdered bodies of their sons, which
Russian mother says,
yes.
"What is my why is my
Yes.
son in Tajikistan?"
Yes, because it's thousand kilometers from the Russia, and today it's not the Soviet Empire, and Tajikistan is not Afghanistan, where we still don't know what we did in Afghanistan during the 10 years, and but I don't see other alternative of Russian military presence in Central Asia, because, for instance,
It's going to
United,
stay.
yes,
It's going to stay.
United Nations peacekeepers are very busy in other hotspots. I mean, from Yugoslavia and other places of the world, and the Tajikistan, as I know, asked help from the ability to have the contingent of UN peacekeepers, but it's a very complex question.
The point is that there's nobody else, as you point out, the United Nations, anybody, who are willing to give security guarantees in this area. Russia is the only country that is interested and willing to provide security guarantees. Now, whether or not you want that security guarantee from the Russians, how much you trust them, that's another issue.
And there's also the issue, as Andrey brought up, is that the Russian public is not keen on this at all. Something that we should put in here is that the Red Army is in more or less a state of economic and collapse, and the morale is very low.
If they go home, there are no jobs, no places to live.
Not only that, but when they're in the field, the Russian soldiers who were demobilized after the Chechen peace accord, they were found begging in the streets in Chechnya because the government could not afford to pay them, could not afford to ship them food, and so forth. They were living like beggars and thieves in the streets. It was a terrible thing. I'd like to pick up on another point. Not only is nobody anxious to be in the Red Army, but there is, in some senses, a growing, I don't want to say militarism, that's too much of a pun here, but Russian mothers have become very active in saying, my son isn't going anywhere. In Chechnya, one of the turning points that led the Russian government to eventually sue for peace is that Russian mothers came down in buses to Chechnya, found their sons, put them on the bus, and drove them back to Russia.
And the other change was the fact that Russian television was covering that, and just as American media are covering Vietnam, the film footage there dramatically affected policies with the United States. Same thing happened in Russia when people began to see what was happening on the ground in places like Chechnya.
How about the other, our media, the American media, focuses on crisis, and the Soviet media clearly focus on Chechnya. What kind of coverage is there of the other Soviet republics by the Moscow press, for example?
Being here, I have opportunity to use internet, and I can see that I found a little information covering
Very little.
in American media. It's I was surprised because it's yes, I can say the Americans has so-called, I can say, the syndrome of CNN, because they only know what they are watching on CNN. And for instance, 5 year of war in Tajikistan, it was forgotten war.
You lost, what, 30,000 people killed?
200,000 people.
200,000?
Yes, were killed. And it's amazing because for 1 year there were killed more than for 5 years war in Nagorno-Karabakh between Azerbaijan and Armenia. Because most part it's not part of these victims, it was civilians. It was the children, it was the women, elders, and the rest world, they forgot about this hot spot.
I would have to say that the war in Tajikistan is probably one of the most uncovered wars by the American media.
Yes, and for instance, I know amongst my friends journalists, the correspondent of BBC radio or Reuters agency, but only one correspondent of Persian service of Voice of America. I don't, and it's a single representative of American media in Tajikistan.
Where was that? Where was your friend stationed? Your friend, the VOA, Voice of America.
He is citizen of Tajikistan.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yes,
so he was a freelance.
Yes.
Contributor.
He's working like freelance. No. He's in staff, but he's Tajik citizen because Tajikistan it's very hot place, and the journalists prefer to live in more quiet countries, Central Asia countries like Kazakhstan, Tashkent, and they bombard the telephone calls the local journalists and asking what happened, but it's not the journalist work, I think.
How many American journalists would you see traveling through Tajikistan in?
Only a couple of TV crew, and probably 2 or 3.
Of course, with a TV crew being there, it does not mean that that footage will get on the air.
Sure.
Because the gatekeepers of news back here will only put on the news they think is going to sell or attract or get the attention of their viewers or readers. And one of the problems I have found is the limited exposure American readers and audiences get because of the way the newspapers and television see their audiences. Once I met with Chicago Tribune and criticized them for their very poor coverage of international news. And they said, I didn't understand what they're all about. They said, they have a lot of foreign news. Indiana, Michigan, Iowa. You know. So that's their approach to it. And how much news of the United States is on Canada? Who covers Canada, for instance? So there's not only fundamental lack of coverage, I'd say, of the entire area of former Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, but a place like Tajikistan, forget it.
Well, what kind of reflection is that of legitimate American interests in the area? I mean, what are American interests in the area?
Well, to the extent as you went back and opened up with this idea of Caspian oil, I think that as this region develops with American business being on the ground, you're going to have the news media following in on that, and I think the future news coverage of this area will increase. But that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get news coverage of the Russian Far East, for instance, of Vladivostok and problems about that area. But I think in the Central Asian states, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, those places, suddenly people will find out if that's where the oil is coming from. People then will be focused on it. During the energy crisis and remember the Arab boycott, people never knew where Abu Dhabi was, but they certainly learned it when they had to line up to get their gasoline at the gas station. Suddenly everybody discovered where the Middle East was.
Valerie, is the United States just going to be a consumer of that Caspian oil, or are there companies involved in the production there?
There'll be companies involved in the production. We've got Mobil and Chevron and Conoco and lots of people in there with billion-dollar oil deals. I think I'd like to follow up on what Leonard was saying and say there's a number of interests. What's really perked our interest, of course, is this huge sea, this ocean of oil that no one knew about before. And that's gotten all the, one commentator said every shark in the world is interested in Caspian Sea oil. But we actually have some other strategic interests there too. Okay, in addition to sort of the great wealth there. Zbigniew Brzezinski just came out with a brand new book in which he talks about the new great game, and he says the new great game is the same as the old great game, and it all hinges on Central Asia. Central Asia is that meeting place, that nexus. Sam Huntington would call it a huge fault area between civilizations, between the West, between the Slavic East, between China, between Islam, and between the Turkic peoples, all meet together here in Central Asia. And in some senses, the great civilizational battles may be played out in Central Asia over the next, I'm not talking about the next decade, but say the next several decades. Brzezinski says, and this
Brzezinski
is
being the former national security advisor.
right, and Brzezinski, of course, is echoing the theories of Halford Mackinder, who talked about the heartland as being where world domination is settled. And Brzezinski feels, I have some caveats about what he says, but Brzezinski feels that whoever is able to control, maybe not in a physical sense, but perhaps in an economic sense, the nations of Central Asia and their loyalties will be the next rising hegemon. Remains to be seen if that's true. But in addition to oil, you also have things like uranium, vast uranium deposits in Kazakhstan, and they also have uranium processing facilities and so forth left over from the Soviet regime. Iran is very interested in coming up with some business deals with Kazakhstan because they have an active nuclear weapons program. It's a whole bunch of interests that coincide all here in this marvelous region of the world.
How much of a factor is the remaining nuclear weaponry, and how much of a factor is smuggling and sales of nuclear weaponry?
It's the second, not so much the first.
Okay.
Okay, we've Kazakhstan has given up, in essence, its nuclear weapons. Ukraine gave up theirs. Belarus gave up theirs.
Kazakhstan got a big payoff from the United States, wasn't it?
Boy, so did Ukraine. I mean, everybody got paid off for giving up their nuclear
to give up
weapons.
the nuclear weapons.
But the question is, you've got the raw materials there. You've got scientists and so forth. The Russian economy is a mess. Kazakhstan and other places are like a sieve through which this material and this knowledge passes through nations that we devoutly do not wish to see gain these capabilities. And that's why we're upset.
Well, it's unfair to ask you as a diplomat how good our diplomacy is in the area, but how good is our diplomacy in the area?
Well, the diplomacy has had its ups and downs. During the Bush administration, under Baker, had a vision of developing a strong presence in each one of these countries. And I at one point had a budget of $1.4 million for each country to establish centers.
Information centers.
Well, not only information centers, but business and culture, joint operations with Peace Corps and other groups to set up the kind of presence that would lead to the kinds of exchanges and teaching and training that we felt was needed. Most of it is gone. There are a few exceptions. There were political and other reasons why some of this didn't help. Some of it, in fact, that the resources just weren't there, the capabilities weren't there to start these things. Places like Almaty, Kazakhstan, Tashkent, there are fully good programs going on. But the other places, there's people flying in. There's like a parachuting correspondent. There's a parachuting diplomat. He comes in, looks over the issues, picks up some of the concerns, and flies back out and tries to run a program out of Vienna or someplace else. So it's a mixed bag. But I think now, with as you point out, the strategic geopolitical interests, you're beginning a reinforcement of, I think, the quality and types of personnel being assigned. And you'll notice that our ambassadors that are in the area are sort of going around musical chairs. They move from one country to the other, so that expertise is not lost.
Other than the United States and Russia, who is messing around in these muddy waters? Who are the players?
Well, you got Pakistan, you have Turkey, and the Russian concern is very much about the Turks. Turks have sort of aspirations which go way beyond their capabilities. You have China, of course, so there's some reason for the Russians to be concerned. Iraq, Iran, of course.
Your country is right on the border with Afghanistan. What kind of Afghanistan, Russia's Vietnam, a horrible experience for Russia, but still Afghanistan is a factor, and you've got the Taliban, the extremists. Are they coming? Are they influencing Tajik extremists, Islamic extremists?
I can say that the Tajik opposition, Islamic opposition, has basis on the Afghan territory, And of course, the Afghanistan government, I mean the government of Mr. Rabbani, not Taliban. It's the official government of Afghanistan. They support the Tajik Islamic opposition. But I don't know about the relationship with the Taliban movement, because the Taliban movement, they mostly they consist of Pushtun population, and Tajik belong to Farsi language population, and
So
they more close to
different religious and ethnic
different
backgrounds.
religious and basically Tajikistan it's more close to Iran, and we've got Iranian shops, I mean the bookshops and so on, because now Iran pay more attention to what happened inside of Tajikistan, because they provide humanitarian assistance and especially ideological assistance. I mean the Iranian books distributed free of charge in the institute, among the universities, secondary schools. Iran invited a lot of Iran has a lot of training programs for teachers and so on, and they more care about the Tajik brains, if I can say, and than other countries. And maybe this is fair for Russia and other countries, because it's real threat. I mean the Islam, purist Islam fundamentalism, because instability in Afghanistan has very negative reflection in Tajikistan and in other countries, because Kyrgyzstan concern where what happened in Afghanistan, because the Kyrgyz minority living in Tajikistan, if something changing in negative side, they fled, they will leave Tajikistan for Kyrgyzstan. The 100,000 so-called Russian-speaking population, they will leave Tajikistan for Russia. 35% of population is ethnic Uzbeks. And it's very interesting.
Living in Tajikistan.
Yes. And another story about the relationship between Tajikistan and Uzbekistan. When the border is closed and the Uzbek authorities, they don't take access for the to pass Uzbek territory on your own car. I can leave my car on Tajik territory and go by foot and walk to the Uzbek territory. It's embarrassing.
Valerie, it sounds to me as though many of these states are terribly roiled by internal dissent, and they're not particularly friendly to each other. Are we going to have to deal with each of these newly independent states individually, or are there coalitions and alliances likely to
That's a wonderful
form?
question. And I
know
think
you've
that's a
got a wonderful
question
answer.
that's being asked in Washington, D.C. probably right now, is we don't, from the American point of view, we don't want to end up with a situation where the Iranians have sort of one stand, the Americans have Uzbekistan, the Russians have Tajikistan, the Chinese have another stand. We don't want sort of a mini little strategic chessboard with everyone backing one particular nation and feeding off of the religious and ethnic and language-based conflicts that are there. And yet, to a certain extent, I see that happening. The stands appear to be fiercely independent. I don't think they will be easily corralled into any sort of alliance with others there, right there on their borders. I don't know whether that's going to be a possibility or not.
But they have formed an association among themselves, and which included, from a Russian point of view, the unwelcome participation of the Iraqis and Iranians also. So I think they themselves recognize that they need to do some regional cooperation, particularly vis-a-vis regional power like Russia. But my concern is putting all our eggs in the Uzbek basket. because, you know, Uzbekis have had these grandiose schemes about being the dominant political force and intellectual force in the region. And I don't think this is welcome. And for us to appear to suddenly have Uzbek as our primary point of focus in that area is a mistake. Kazakhstan, I think, is extremely important to maintain as another vital relationship. For a while there, everything was in Kyrgyzstan. Kyrgyzstan was our favorite because it seemed to have made the most progress toward democratic institutions and had an election which seemed to be fairly democratic. But none of these governments are democracies. Mm-hmm. And suddenly for these leaders to be lauded in Washington for their progressive developments and movements, I think is ridiculous.
I'd like to add to this, though. They do recognize that if they were able to overcome their differences, they would be a much bigger force.
That's right.
The problem, as Mr. Baldyga said, and that Andrey has also supported, is that that's nice to say, but there's virtually no action to back it up. Let me give you an example. The Aral Sea. Okay, let's talk about the Aral Sea. It's supposedly the world's...
Explain to our listeners where it is, our viewers where it is.
With Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan's kind of right there. It's one of the, I think, the largest interior lake in the world,
Yeah.
is it not?
Yeah.
Well, this largest interior lake in the world is expected to almost completely dry up within the next 20 to 30 years. The reason is the Soviets built these incredible irrigation projects, right, that diverted the flow of the rivers that empty into the Aral Sea. So Uzbek towns that were once on the shores of the Aral Sea are now 70 miles away from the Aral Sea. And Uzbekistan has said, wait, everyone, we must unite together and reduce our consumption of water so the Aral Sea won't disappear. Well, what do you think the reception to this has been along the route? It's like, well, we're real sorry, but that would cause us severe hardships. Gosh, darn the Aral Sea. Boy, that's a tragedy. So there's a lot more rhetoric than there is actual cooperation on the ground in terms of pressing problems of the region.
You don't, none of you paint a very enthusiastic picture about the existence of democracy in a lot of these republics. But one of the, if we can't get a democratic government, what prospects for democratic press? We in the American press feel this urge to export our principles abroad.
Well, this is the problem with American urges. We need to be patient, persevering, and persistent. And we want results immediately. And USAID, for instance, requires quarterly report on democratic progress through various programs. So how do you measure democracy in quarterly terms? It's not an approach that's really logical. It's going to take a long time. And I think as we continue to support civil society movements, non-governmental organization, help educational reform, help with market reforms, help with building independent press, build up the internet communication systems that are just dramatically developing in those areas. It'll take time, and I think they'll come around to it. And I don't know if democracy follows business relationships or not, but it's going to open up this area. And you also remember that it's more than, let's say, 1983 when I was last running the East European program. At that time of the Afghan sanctions, we had about 100 Russians coming to the United States. We began to get thousands of Chinese. And we've seen the dramatic impact of these Chinese on what's been happening in China internally. We have now coming to the United States 12,000 Russians and persons from the NIS over to just U.S. government programs.
Being brought here
annually, yes, on a far range
various periods of time.
For periods of time. And I think this is bound to have an impact. And there are a lot of programs dealing with these areas of Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan. Young people coming over, and you yourself are a representative of this kind of program. So just be patient. Things are. I'm not as gloomy of the long-term development in this area as maybe some others are, who see again a collapse of Russia in economic terms or disasters down in the Central Asia area. Crime, corruption, Those are serious problems. Health, serious problems. But I think slowly these areas will develop. There's too much already on the ground.
Andrey, you're the editor of a very interesting newspaper yourself, in that it is partly government supported and partly
the Union of Journalists.
Union of Journalists. Tell us that to many American journalists that would seem an impossible situation. Tell us how it works.
Yeah, yes, my newspaper is the joint edition of the Union of Journalists and the Ministry of Information and Culture. Yes, and I can say I on myself influence the pressure of the government when we are covering events, I mean especially political events, or it's journalist investigation and so on, because a lot of the top officials involved in the crime activity. And but I can say that I'm agree with the figures of which I found in the Radio Liberty web suite.
Radio Liberty was the officially supported U.S. government radio broadcasting into Eastern Europe and the Soviet states.
Yes, and according statistics, the Tajikistan, like the other countries, Central Asia countries like Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, it's a countries where there is no freedom of word, freedom of press.
Radio Liberty's sister broadcasting operation, Radio Free Europe, is credited with perhaps not originating the revolution in Eastern Europe, but certainly contributing to it in that I think various Polish leaders have spoken very glowingly of the contribution of Radio Free Europe.
Well, you cannot credit one institution for what has happened in these countries. Some people credit the Pope, some people credit radios, some people say it's just indigenous, historic revolt against oppressive systems. So I'd be very careful about just saying that certainly. You have to remember Deutsche Welle, BBC, Voice of America, we're all doing the same thing, except they're approaching it slightly different way. So I would be very cautious there. But I think Radio Liberty still has a role to play in this part of the world because of the lack of an independent media. Less so now in sort of the Eastern Europe. Still in places like Albania, less so again in Bulgaria, Romania because of recent developments. So you have to look at these things very carefully. And of course, you have to remember now Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty correspondents are actually on the ground reporting from those areas.
True. No restriction on listening to Radio Liberty.
No. And the Radio Liberty has the Tajik service. And that is why the Radio Liberty information is the reliable sources of information. And when, as a journalist, asking yourself what happened yesterday and so on, and the most interesting information we know listening to this radio, because it's the real free radio. And according to the mass media in Tajikistan, I can say that due to the crisis in economic, it's reflected on Tajik media because we
putting out a newspaper.
Yes, we
can't make money, and so that jeopardizes your existence.
Yes. And we haven't, for instance, the daily newspapers in Tajikistan, and because the high cost of electricity, paper, and print services doesn't allow to print every day. And on other hands, a lot of cases when the government they block it to print newspaper issue because something wrong, something information is not pleasant for government.
This is where the internet comes in play. You don't
amazing.
need paper
Yeah.
to put out a newspaper, or I mean, at least put out some kind of a publication. So electronic publishing, electronic reporting is something that's developing, and this is being pushed by the Russian-American Press and Information Center in Moscow. It's being pushed by ProMedia in other parts. It's being pushed by USAID. Is to break
Just to explain a little bit about ProMedia, Leonard.
Well, ProMedia is a USAID funded program to support the independent media, and strictly independent media in 9 areas of Eastern and Southeastern Europe. So you're talking about Croatia, Serbia, Montenegro, Albania, Bulgaria, Romania, nothing in Poland or Czech Republic, a small program in Hungary. But the point is to build up the professional background and training of the journalists on the ground so that they become reliable transmitters of information needed for people to be able to make decisions about their own society.
By seminars and by sending
seminars, hands-on training, exchanges to the United States, equipment supplies, giving them modems, building radio stations, as is being done right now in Banja Luka under a USAID grant, open broadcast program, they call it. It's setting up a journalistic association, setting up freedom of information activities, setting up systems of cyberspace programs now. There's a cyberspace program in center developed in Moscow. There's a mid-Volga news network being set up with 42 newspapers that are independent so they can feed information news back to each other and not be dependent on Moscow. And there's another group of Partnership of Independent Newspapers, PIN it's called. Sister Cities International has linked up 13 Russian newspapers with 13 newspapers in the United States, and on a pro bono basis they help with the development of management, advertising. To the extent that your newspaper understands the relationship between advertising and an independent operation, then they can break away from the government subsidies and controlled by some political, local, or central power. All these things are going on, but people don't realize the penetration that the internet has made in the Russian, Ukraine, Central Europe, or even in the STAN countries. Through the university networks that IREX, for instance, have been doing. We've been developing internet linkages between universities and non-governmental associations. But there are now commercial internet operations functioning throughout these areas. Extremely expensive, but there's an Uzbek free net that we set up so that Uzbekis can plug into it and be on the internet. We're teaching them how to develop their worldwide web pages. So the newspapers now are learning to develop web pages with advertising on it so they can get some income so they don't have to be dependent on the government.
Wasn't that a criticism of some of the early programs that the West, particularly the United States, initiated, that journalists in Eastern Europe said, well, wait a minute, we sort of know how to write, but what we really need is management help, how to run a circulation department, how to develop advertising sales, how to collect the money from...
Well, this is true at a certain point in time where you need to break away from the training of reportage and into how to make money. And the last trip I had Prague when I was at the Center for International Journalism there, they said, stop sending us people telling us how to write. Send me somebody how to make money, marketing, advertising specialists. And a very big component of all these programs, management, marketing, advertising. And you'll see it all across the board. But, and these programs have been on the ground for several years, particularly the Russian-American Press Information Center, run by New York University, and Internews from out of California. I mean, these are revolutionary approaches to the developments in that area. They not only run 6 centers throughout Russia and has everybody linked together, they conduct press conferences almost daily on critical issues dealing with environment, nuclear proliferation, press freedom, crime, and then these things are picked up by the newspapers and other independent media, and then picked up sometimes even by the Moscow television.
Your staff uses internet?
No, because Tajikistan hasn't access to internet yet. But the Soros Foundation, the National Department of the
Soros, the American financier,
yes.
who's
And he, I can say, he provides for huge financial assistance for Tajikistan, and probably at the end of this year we will have access to internet. Yes, it's obviously it's should facilitate our work to make it more easy, and to make more freely, because a lot of information, and I'm amazing when I'm working in internet. That I'm the journalist of American journalist has huge opportunity to find any information they want to have. It's
just pull it up.
It's great.
The infrastructure of the countries are a problem here, because if your telephone system doesn't work, you know, how do you plug into the internet? And what we've been trying to do is then to select a university or some other non-governmental district to become the node for the transmission and providing the service. And this is what's been happening. And it's just like there's an Uzbek free net, there's a Kyrgyz free net. And so university-based linkages that not only link the entire country, but link the regions. But the media here is the primary focus, because everybody understands you don't have democracy unless you have a free press. That's
and governments can't really crack down on the internet. I mean, several have tried, but it's really pretty
France
impossible.
has tried, you know. France is extremely nervous about what the internet means of undermining French culture when everything is in English. Another breakthrough in Russia, in order to break away from government controls and subsidies, is people realize that just recently the first independent printing press was established in Volgograd, where 5 newspapers there, independent newspapers, got together, and we of course provided the press. But now they're going to have a printing institution that not only will do printing for everybody else and make money, but now they don't have to be dependent on the government printing plant in order to be able to come out.
Well, that gets back to Andrey's problem, if you will, in Tajikistan. And we've just got a few minutes left, but in those few minutes, tell me how a newspaper run by journalists in partnership with the Ministry of Information operates. I mean, do you get signals from the ministry by written directive, or do you do it by osmosis? How do you know when you are treading on delicate ground?
It's a big dilemma for us to select information, because the government demands to cover official news like the president's speech or presidential decree and parliament session and so on. But the government, in its term, has the president has own newspaper, the Tajik parliament has newspaper, and we are trying to on our pages to give opportunity of our readers. There are journalists, professors, students, intelligentsia. It's like the open discussion. It's arena for open discussion. But we have, and at the same time, we have problems because we are covering the articles which are against the government, because the opinion is different. It's so many heads, so many ideas.
Well, it's a tough job. Well, I'm afraid we are at the end of our time, and I just compliment you all three on bringing light to this very complicated subject. You were kind to be with us, Leonard Baldyga, Valerie Hudson, and Andrey Sidorin. We wish you a safe trip back to Tajikistan, by the way. And we hope that both our studio audience and our listeners and viewers on television and radio will have been enlightened and have consciousness somewhat raised about a very important part of the world. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, John.